Hi, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to continue exploring macros. Macros are very powerful, and in our previous session we looked at how it can be utilized to repeat a calculation or some other process that you tend to run quite often, thus alleviating you of the need to reprogram it every time in a new workflow, or to, as I typically do, cut and paste something that already exists, modifying it slightly for the process at hand, and then going on from there. So John Q, my buddy that's just learning how to deal with data, absolutely loved those little macros, but he was wondering if there's something more he can do with a macro other than just repeat a known process. And I said, yes, we need to learn how to take action in a macro. And this is where you allow the data that's coming into the macro to control or define what the macro does. As you progress down this pathway, it's good to note that there are some pitfalls to watch out for or to develop around. There's some things you might have to do a bit strangely to get them to be accomplished within the macro. And so you always have to ask yourself, is this a macro that will assist me or just cause me more work along the way? I'd leave that up to you to make that decision when you begin to develop macros. I do that choice all the time. And for today's lesson, we're going to be looking at utilizing macros to help us input from our MySQL database and to output into our MySQL database. The first macro that we'll be looking at, I probably would never actually use, except in a situation to where I had a specific need for being able to control what happens in input, or if I had a junior developer that was a bit confused about input and I would show them a simpler way of just getting the input in a repetitive manner because they continue to make mistakes doing it. That being said, let's go ahead and delve into these two macros that I created for John Q. We'll talk about them. If you have any questions, please put it in the comments and I'll get back to you and answer any questions about these macros. I'm not going to develop these live because it gets a bit tedious and would really delay what we're doing today. So let's take a look at our starting point. As you may have remembered, we have our puppy table that goes into a dimension and to a fact. John Q had a lot of fun and he took and he rewrote part of an old work stream that I had given him to just simply populate the puppy fact table, and as you can see, he utilized our lookup macros and our add timestamp macros from our previous lesson in order to streamline developing this, and he really liked it, and that's when he asked what more can we do. So if you look at this workflow, you see that we do have a couple places that macros might be able to help us, but at least they give us the ability to go ahead and have a discussion as to how action can help you with your macro. In this case, you can see here we're reading 3 inputs from our MySQL database. We can make this a bit quicker to do once we develop the macro, possibly, but it takes choices out of it. But at least it gives us the ability to go ahead and look at how to use actions. And then finally, we have this whole output condition thought process that John Q had adopted from what I had written for him, to where you put both the create table and the delete and append, and then you turn them on or off depending upon what you're trying to do. So first, let's look at our input macro. Very simple. If you have input coming into your workflow, you have an input widget. Within that input widget, you define the name of the table. In this case, it was the puppy table. You also defined how you connect to the database and what is the name of that database. We wanted to go ahead and make sure our SQL style, this one actually is quoted. I tend to send it to none, but John Q forgot. And we go on from there. It's a couple of little minor things to do. It gets tedious if you do it over and over again. But this is where we also have the ability to get a macro to help us. Let's look at an input Daisy Hill table macro. And you can see we've got a couple of widgets, some of which you're familiar with, some of which you might not be yet familiar with. But in the middle of this, again, a macro tends to be defined as being executable to begin with before it's run in a macro mode. So here I have my input data widget where it's going into from my SQL database using ODBC, and we're using a stubbed table called till_dual, and we're going to want to change this every time that this macro runs. So I told John Q to go ahead and insert this macro into where he is reading them, but he needs to be able to tell this macro what the name of the table is, because this macro has, and we'll go to the interface tab very quickly, it has a control parameter, and basically I'm asking for this input to be a table name. So to control how this macro works, you need to provide it a table name. And what I want to do very quickly, if you look at this, is that I want to replace this table name right here with the one that's provided by the workflow. And how I get that changed is I'd go ahead and I drop an action widget in the middle. So it's being fed from queue to queue with the parameter coming in. The lightning bolt at the end says that it's going to take action on this widget and do some additional change or work. What I want to do here in the middle is that we are getting in this string, and I want to update a specific value. If you browse through here and expand all of these out, you'll see that there is lots of things that you can change. So basically through action, you can change any of these pieces of information that's associated with how this macro will work. What we want to do is within this file value, we want to change the name of this table to what's being passed in. So we choose the update value from the action, and down the bottom we click replace a specific string. When we do this, this entire string is placed in there, and then we can edit it out so that it has just the name of the table that is in this stubbed string. In that case, it's till_dual. Coming in, then this action will then take and change that name to what's passed in as a value, and it will pass through as output. Again, this is our macro output. It'll pass the stream coming back out again. How we need to do that here is that we'll just want to go ahead and get rid of the puppy table here. We don't need the input. We want to insert a macro. Insert macro. I've got this opened already in my development window, so it's sitting there as our input. So I connect my input into it, but what I need to do is provide it the name of the table. And I can do that very simply by coming into my text input, dragging this down here. So what I need to do is edit this input. We're going to give that a name of my table. Give it the name of puppy table, making sure it's spelled right, otherwise it will give us an error. We connect these two up. We tell it which field to use, which is my table. Click. Since we'll be getting rid of these two at the end of this with another macro, we want to go ahead and make it so that when this runs, it will run through and give us a browse and not actually try to attach to the database. We can now run this. And we can see that the data that came out is what we anticipated, because now this macro actually reads the data for us. One of the things we want to make sure that we do when we run this and see the macro, we want to click on Show All Macro Messages, because it doesn't tell us what the macro did here. Now if we do that and we click on this, and we can see that it's telling us from the macro that it ran and queried things. So now we can see the output from each of the macros that we ran. So we want to repeat this process with the breed dimension. So we want to go ahead and we can delete this off. For the sake of copying, we can go ahead and copy these two. So now we have two additional copies of that widget. What we want to do here now is, rather than puppy table, say that this is the breed dimension. And we hook that up to here. Again, trying to hook this up. It doesn't know what we need to do because it hasn't seen the data. So we need to run this once so that it will know what data is coming out of this macro. Now the data comes out of the macro. We know we want to look at WID and use the breed name. Before we run that, we'll go ahead and do the same thing with this final connection. Again, there's a number of ways that I could provide this information, but again, incrementally, I would be developing this one step at a time. I won't be running into quite some of these little issues that I have to rerun it, but this gives you the feeling, the understanding of how a macro helps you and also still gets in your way. And again, I'm not so sure that this is the most useful way of doing a macro, but it gives John Q an idea of what you can do with a macro as far as changing the parameters coming in for a widget. This being a simple widget, one thing to do. Let's go ahead and run this temporarily. Kind of looks like it automatically made the connections that we wanted it to, which was very nice for it to do. So here we have WID and breed name. Here we have WID and kennel name. Here we add timestamp into it, and our data comes out clean. So John Q didn't have to actually create and know how to parameterize his input widget going into the MySQL database. Instead, what he did was simply use a macro, use the text input to go into that macro, and off it goes. This was a big help to John Q, made him understand a little bit more. Also made him understand how he might be able to make life easier for some of his junior developers. So next we need to take a look at how to get some of this output taken care of, because again, we had a little bit of a specific way of doing this output. The first time we ran through it, we wanted to go ahead and create the table with the primary key. Second time through, we just wanted to delete the data and append the new records. And we wanted to be able to select which one of those we did for each run. So it would be nice if we had a macro that would take that bit more complex problem and run. And so we will next look at the output macro. This is the output macro that I created for John Q. A lot of lines on this macro. It is pretty easy to take a simple macro and make it look fairly complicated, but we're going to talk about a couple things that we want to do here. Very quickly look at the basic processing of all of this. Basically what we have is we have a create table output widget. It's going into the MySQL database. It creates a new table. And don't forget that when we create that new table, we want to go ahead and add a primary key to it. To that conclusion, what we will want to do is when we're running this macro is to change the name of the table from ZZ top to what the user requests. We want to also go into this post SQL statement and change both the table name ZZ top here as well as the primary key columns. So this is the information that the execution data stream needs to provide us. Alternately, if we go ahead and want to do the truncate table, all that we need to do here is to change this table name. But how do we determine which one of these we run and don't run? Well, that's because we have them within my documentation of a tool container. So for the tool container, don't forget if you look at it, you have this disable capability. So what we want to do is be able to have our macro disable the documentation So what we want to do here is have our macro disable the tool container that we don't want to execute. So that's what all of this comes about. So what do we need in here? Well, obviously we need some input. We have one piece of input here, which is the data stream coming in. Then we have let's go ahead and choose on the interfaces. We now have our control parameter of table name, our control parameter of primary key columns, and our control panel of the table action that we need to take. Drag this over a little bit, you can see it says create table flag there. So with those pieces of input, how do we execute this? Well, first of all, we have to get that data stream from input into our output widget. Actually, both of these, so you can see that there are two streams come. I put a select in here that goes ahead, and if you notice that for my test, I simply have one input field, because again, I have to stub it out. It does not know what data is coming in, and then that feeds both of my output widgets. If you remember our widget that did the lookup, we did have an issue, and we didn't solve it because it was not a problem, and that is that the input field name is changed because we have to identify within this input a specific field that is being used in the stream. So, and then the unknowns take care of all the additional fields. But what this means is that the first field coming in, or the field that we identify to connect the input stream to the actual input of the macro, it will have its field name changed. We don't want to do that. So the very first action we have to do is coming off of this input. This is going through a queue and going from the lightning to lightning to connect the action of the input into the change of the select. In this case, our action is a pretty specific one because the action widget, when you're configuring it, understands what it's connected to. So one of the select actions that we can take is update the select with reverse field map. Very confusing little statement, but what this means is that Alteryx maintains metadata for each of your fields. So it knows the field name of all of your fields that came into your macro. And even though it changed its name as it came into the macro, it still remembers its original name. And so this action tells the macro to go ahead and change the name of the input fields to match what they came in as the input and not the new name that was given by the perimeter connection process in the original workflow. This is great. It gives this stream back its original name, so they go into the database with the way that we wanted to name them. Pretty easy, pretty slick. It's one thing people don't realize exists out there, and you can use it to your use as you need to in your macro work streams. So that was great. Now let's take a look at coming in with the table name, because that's pretty straightforward. We have a value coming in called table name. What we want to do is we need to take 3 actions with that table name. The first one here is just like before. We're going to update a value, a specific string, and that is in the file value that defines the name of the table. We want to go ahead and change the table name to be the input table name. We have to do that twice, once for the create table output, and over here, if you follow it through, down here and over, we're also going to do it for the truncate table option. And again, we'll just be changing the name ZZ top in the file name string to the name of the table that's coming in. That was great. Then the second thing that we have to do, or the third thing in this case, second thing to this, is in the create table. We had that alter table statement, if you remember, that creates the primary key. We also need in that to change the ZZ top string to the name of the table that's coming in, so that alter table works properly as opposed to SQL when we actually execute it. So again, we have one parameter coming in, and it's doing 3 separate actions within our macro workflow. And then finally, we do the same thing. We're passing in the primary key columns. We want to go ahead and in this same PostSQL where we had the input wid, we want to change that to the primary key that's being passed in. So that will change all of this. So given that, all of these will execute properly, but we don't want both of them to execute. So we're going to pull a little trick here, or another piece of logic. Again, we want to pass in the create table flag. That will be a true or a false. We pass this into the condition widget. and we simply check to see whether or not that first expression is true. If that first expression is true, we want to take action over here. Again, what we're saying is that we want to create the table, not truncate the table. So if that action is true, we will go ahead and act upon the truncate table. And what we will do here is to enable or disable the container is the option, and we then update the value to say that we want to disable it. So if true, we want to create table comes in, then we want to disable the truncate table container so that what's inside of it does not get executed. The condition coming in being false, which that means is that we want to do the truncate table and not the create table, well then we need to take action on the first container. And again, it's the exact same action. We want to enable, disable the container for the condition. We want to update the container to be disabled. So coming in, we pass this information that gives us full programmatic or data control over the process that's going on. We don't have to worry about the ins and outs and defaults. We just have to go ahead and pass the values in. So how do we do that? Well, right here, what we want to do is go ahead and bring in our new macro and pass it into parameters. So drop that down. Let's go ahead and insert our macro. Again, it's here in our workspace, so it's easy to find. Why connected over there? I have no idea. Let's go ahead and delete it. It comes over here now, because what we want to do is to connect our job stream up. So the inflow goes into this input. But what we have to do here is go ahead and deal with these questions. Again, we have these 4 questions that have to be answered. First of all, the input widgets coming in, that's the data. How do we match that up? Again, this is necessary just simply to get the flow of data into the macro. So this is our input flow. We choose puppy wid, and keep in mind the macro will then change it back to its proper name rather than input wid. We now need a table name, a primary key columns, and the create table flag. The best way to do that again is our text input. So here we want to go ahead and give it one of out table. For the first parameter, we want to do PK columns. And then finally, execute, or let's create flag. For our first test, we're going to do this true so we can see it fail. The PK columns in this one happens to be puppy wid. Verify that by looking here at the data stream as it came out. Remember, it's puppy with all capitals. Need to get that exactly correct. And the out table is, for this case, let's go ahead and do this as puppy back table. Again, we're going to go ahead and create this, so that should give us an error and run pretty quickly. We connect this input data into our question mark, which is our parameters. We need to link them up. So for the table name, it is out table. For the primary key columns, it is PK columns. And for the create flag, it is the create flag. Everything connect up should run fine. Remember that we'll be able to see the output coming from. So if we run this, it's going to use the macros to read the data, look up the data, add the timestamp, and then give us an error goes into the macro. We look down here and say that it had an error creating the table. It had an error executing the alter table, so therefore no data was run through it. That's exactly what we expected to happen. So now we want to go ahead and do our append. All that we have to do in this case is choose this to false. So we will not be creating the table. We run this. And we can see it's now processing through and writing that data, which will take a bit. So we'll hit this pause just for a moment, so you don't have to wait for the output to be written into my AWS MySQL database.